Right now, Lake Powell sits at roughly 3,522 feet. Doesn't sound alarming, except the dam fails at 3,490, not fails like a metaphor, fails like turbines shredding themselves apart from air bubbles exploding inside them. That's 32 feet of margin on a reservoir that lost 3.5 feet last month alone. Everyone says the fix is simple. Wait for snow, fill the lake back up. I need you to sit with this, because even a full lake wouldn't undo what's broken underneath it. This isn't a drought story. It's an engineering story nobody wants to say out loud. I manage water systems for a living, and I want to be precise here, right from the start, because the numbers in this story matter far more than the panic does. Lake Powell is not almost empty because of bad luck. It's at roughly 22% of capacity because of a chain of physical decisions made decades ago that are only now getting tested for real, under conditions the original design assumptions never accounted for. And I keep watching people online treat this like a weather problem. Rain will fix it, snowpack will fix it. That's the public version. It's not wrong exactly. It's just missing almost everything that actually determines whether this dam keeps functioning the way people assume it will. Let's start with the number everyone quotes and nobody explains. As of late June, Lake Powell sat at 3,525.17 feet, 174 feet below full pool, about 24% of live capacity. Every article stops there, like the story is, the lake is low. But that's not the mechanism. That's just the symptom. The actual threshold that matters, the one engineers are watching hour by hour, is 3,490 feet. That's minimum power pool. Below that line, water dropping into the turbine intakes starts pulling air down with it, and that air forms vortices, tiny bubbles that collapse violently once they're inside the machinery. It's called cavitation, and it is not a performance dip. It's shock waves eating solid steel from the inside, turbine by turbine. You don't limp along at reduced output when that starts. You shut the whole thing down before it destroys itself. So the real story isn't drought. The real story is a hard physical wall sitting 32 feet under the current surface, and a reservoir that's been sliding toward it in slow motion for years. Reclamation's own April projection said Powell could drop below that wall by August of this year without intervention. That's not a hypothetical model somebody floated on a podcast. That's the federal agency that runs the dam, telling you the countdown clock in writing, in an official release, months in advance. And here's the part that should bother you more than the drought framing does. This dam generates power for about 5 million people across the Southwest. Not, the lake looks sad in photos. 5 million people's electricity is downstream of a mechanical threshold that's currently closer than most viewers realize. I don't say that to scare you into clicking somewhere else. I say it because the framing, just wait for rain, makes it sound passive, like nature will sort this out on its own schedule. Meanwhile, the agency running the dam is actively managing around a failure point that's already inside the operating conversation, not some far-off worst case they're quietly hoping never arrives. This is also not a new warning that just appeared this year. The reservoir set a record low back in April of 2023, and current levels are sitting only a few feet above that mark. That's not a one-time scare that came and went. That's the same threshold getting approached again, on a shorter timeline, after everyone had already been told once how close this system runs to its limits. I find that part more concerning than the raw number itself. A near miss should change how a system gets managed. Here, it mostly changed how many articles got written about it. And it's not like this data is hidden. Reclamation publishes one finalized elevation reading every single day. On a recent daily reading, the net change, inflow minus release, came out to roughly negative 3,929 cubic feet per second. That's not a rounding error. That's the lake actively losing ground on a daily accounting basis in a public data set anyone can pull up. So when people say, we didn't see this coming, I want to be precise. The data was never the missing piece. Somebody was watching this number every day. The gap was never information. The gap was what got done with it. Okay, so here's where people usually go next. Fine, but a big snow year fixes this, doesn't it? That's the assumption baked into almost every comment section I've read. And I get why. Powell is fed by one seasonal event, the spring runoff, sometimes called the Big Fill. Miss that window and there's no second attempt until next year. So it feels intuitive that a strong winter just resets the whole problem back to normal. Except look at what actually happened this water year. Projected inflow came in around 52% of average. The April to July big fill, the one shot the whole system depends on, hit only about 38% of normal. That's not a little dry. That's the reservoir's one refill mechanism running at roughly a third of what it needs in a year when the margin above minimum power pool was already down to double digits. And I want to flag something here because it matters for how you read forecasts generally. Earlier projections had briefly suggested a healthier spring, something closer to full average inflow, before the actual numbers came in far below that. The forecast moved. The lake didn't get the benefit of the optimistic version. And here's the reversal that I think matters most in this whole story. Officials are not actually chasing full anymore. They're not even chasing healthy. The stated operational target has quietly become stay above 3,490. Staying 32 feet above a mechanical failure point is being treated, functionally, as a win. Nobody announced that shift with a press conference. It just became the baseline while everyone was still arguing about lake photos and stranded boat ramps. The bar moved, and most of the public never noticed it moving. And here's what most coverage of the drought completely leaves out. Officials aren't actually waiting around for snow to solve this. In April, Reclamation announced it would release between 600,000 and 1 million acre-feet of water out of Flaming Gorge Reservoir on the Utah-Wyoming border, specifically to prop Powell's elevation back up. At the same time, they cut Powell's own annual release through Glen Canyon Dam from the usual 7.48 million acre-feet down to just 6 million, the lowest release volume in decades. That's the real intervention happening right now, quietly, while the public conversation stays fixated on whether next winter's snowpack will save the day. Notice what they didn't tap. Blue Mesa Reservoir and Navajo Reservoir, the other two upstream units in the same emergency toolkit, got left alone this time, specifically because they're already too depleted themselves to spare the water. Blue Mesa was sitting around 47% full. That's not a minor detail. That's the safety margin from the last emergency already spent and not fully recovered, because this isn't the first time this exact maneuver got used. Back in 2021 and 2022, at the height of an earlier near collapse, Powell and Mead combined fell to 27% full, the lowest combined level ever recorded at that point. Turbines at Powell were generating roughly half their normal electricity, and the cost of replacing that lost hydropower jumped more than 30%. To stop the bleeding, Reclamation ordered emergency releases from Flaming Gorge and Blue Mesa for the first time in the program's history. It worked, in the sense that Powell got propped back up, but local marinas around Blue Mesa were forced to close. The drawdown reportedly contributed to an algal bloom at the reservoir, and the extra cold water releases downstream warmed up river temperatures in ways that harmed threatened and endangered fish species the system is legally supposed to protect. Park Service staff later recommended against using that same emergency toolkit again, or at minimum coordinating it around the needs of those fish, according to comments filed during the public process. So the pattern here isn't drought happening once and getting fixed. It's the same emergency lever getting pulled repeatedly, with real ecological and economic costs each time, while the underlying deficit never actually closes. This year, that lever has less room to pull than it did in 2022, because 2 of the 3 backup reservoirs are already too drawn down to help. That's the first crack in the just fill it narrative. Here's the second one, and this is the part I don't hear anybody talking about, and it's the part that actually worries me professionally. Below the penstocks, the intake structures that feed water into the power turbines. Glen Canyon Dam has 3 bypass pipes called the River Outlet Works. Their entire job is to keep water physically moving downstream even if the power generation side of the dam goes fully offline. Think of them as the dam's emergency plumbing, sitting well below the machinery everyone actually pays attention to. If the power pool fails, this is supposedly the fallback that keeps Arizona, Nevada, and California getting water at all. These outlet works were built into the dam when it was completed back in the 1960s, sized as a supporting feature for a reservoir that was designed to spend most of its life much closer to full. Nobody designing that structure was optimizing it around the specific scenario of what if this becomes the primary route for water delivery for an extended stretch of years. It was a secondary system for a situation planners assumed would be rare and short. Here's the problem. Those bypass pipes have never been tested running at that kind of sustained, extended capacity. Not once, not at this scale, not for this long. Zach Podmore, who wrote a book specifically about this exact scenario, put it plainly. If the lake level fell below the penstocks, you start having engineering concerns with the dam itself, not just water delivery concerns. Read that again. The backup plan for keeping water flowing to millions of people is a mechanism whose real-world performance is, right now, still a hypothesis sitting in a canyon. I want to be fair here. Legitimate engineering doesn't mean guaranteed to work. Bypass systems are built with margins, and they're not automatically doomed just because they're untested at full extended duration. Plenty of backup infrastructure sits unused for decades and performs fine the one time it's called on. But when your fallback for a catastrophic failure mode is itself an open question, that's not a safety net. That's a safety net with an asterisk. And I don't think we assume it'll hold is a sentence that should be doing that much quiet work in a system serving 25 million people who never voted on that assumption. Now, let's separate two thresholds that keep getting mashed together in coverage, because conflating them is exactly how people end up misunderstanding the actual risk they're facing. Minimum power pool, 3,490 feet, is where hydropower generation stops. Bad, expensive, a real grid problem for 5 million people. But water can still physically move downstream through those outlet works I just described, assuming they perform as intended. Deadpool is a different, much worse failure. That starts at 3,370 feet, a full 120 feet below minimum power pool. At that elevation, water can no longer flow past the dam by gravity at all. Roughly 240 feet of water would sit trapped at the bottom of the canyon, completely unreachable for the states relying on it. Not reduced flow, no flow. That's the scenario where the actual plumbing of the river breaks, not just the electricity running through it. Most public coverage blurs these into one vague headline declaring that Powell is in crisis. They are not the same crisis. One is a power grid emergency. The other is an emergency over whether water physically reaches Arizona and Southern California anymore. And right now, the lake sits with meaningfully more distance above deadpool than above minimum power pool, which sounds almost reassuring until you realize what it actually means. The power failure threshold gets tested first on its own timeline, independent of whether the water delivery collapse is close behind it. Here's a piece of context that almost never makes it into the water level headlines. And honestly, it's the piece that changes how I read this entire situation. The current operating rules governing how Powell and Lake Mead are managed together, how much water gets released, how the two reservoirs get balanced against each other, run under the 2007 interim guidelines and the 2024 interim guidelines supplemental decision. Those frameworks are the legal skeleton underneath every technical decision I've just walked you through. And as of early this year, record low snowpack and dwindling inflow were converging at almost the exact same moment those guidelines were approaching renegotiation among the 7 basin states. So this isn't purely a hydrology problem anymore. It's a hydrology problem colliding with a multi-state negotiation that hasn't been finalized. That's not politics for the sake of politics. That's the actual operating manual for the dam, potentially changing shape, while the reservoir is simultaneously testing its hardest physical limits in decades. Nobody can tell you with total confidence what the release rules look like in the gap between an expiring framework and a lake sitting on an engineering wall. That's a genuine unknown, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just to give you a tidier ending. What we can say is that the timing of that overlap is not a coincidence anyone should feel comfortable about. Now let's talk about what the public actually sees, because I think this is where the story gets almost unfair to people who aren't tracking the elevation data daily. At 3,500 feet, a lot of the traditional boat launch ramps around Lake Powell become high and dry. That's the visual the public reacts to: stranded ramps, bathtub rings on the canyon walls, local tourism operators adjusting their whole season around a shrinking waterline. It's real. It's an economic hit for a region whose businesses depend on people showing up with boats. But here's the reversal. That visible failure point sits roughly 10 feet above the actual mechanical failure point. The ramps going dry are the cosmetic symptom. The engineering wall is invisible from the shoreline. People are reacting to the wrong 10 feet and getting genuinely worried about a problem that isn't actually the dangerous one. And local management's messaging follows a pattern I recognize from a lot of badly communicated water crises. The lake remains open. The experience will just look different this year. That's not false. It's also doing a lot of quiet reassurance work, while the actual number that matters keeps sliding closer to 3,490 in the background, mostly out of frame. It's a very diplomatic way of describing a reservoir that's quietly renegotiating its own definition of normal. And look, I get it. Nobody wants to put "we are 32 feet from turbine cavitation" on a tourism brochure. But that's exactly the gap between the story people are being told and the story the elevation data is actually telling. Here's the piece that actually explains why just send more water downstream isn't the clean fix people assume either. And it's the part that ties everything else in this story together. Powell and Lake Mead are coordinated under a tiered release structure. Releases from Powell get calibrated against Mead's elevation, and vice versa. Which means, if Lake Mead is struggling, and you push more water downstream from Powell to relieve it, you are directly accelerating Powell's own slide toward minimum power pool. This is a shared system with 2 drains and 1 shrinking faucet. You cannot solve a shortage on one side by draining the other side faster. You're just choosing which failure happens first and hoping you chose the less catastrophic one. And that's the deeper problem with the entire Just Fill Lake Powell framing that gave this story its headline. There is no volume of water you can move around inside this system that manufactures more input. The actual constraint is snowpack and inflow, full stop. You can't engineer your way around a shrinking water year. A treatment plant can't fix a nutrient source it never addresses. A bypass pipe can't fix an inflow deficit. Moving water between 2 connected reservoirs doesn't create water anywhere in the system. It just relocates which reservoir hits its wall first on whose watch. I want to be fair about something else too, because I think it matters for how you should actually feel walking away from this. Nothing here proves Glen Canyon Dam is about to catastrophically fail tomorrow. The bypass system might perform fine under sustained load. We genuinely don't know yet, and untested is not the same word as broken. What I'm saying is that the public confidence in "we'll just fill the lake and this resolves itself" is built on a story that skips the actual mechanical constraints entirely. That gap between how confident people feel and how much engineering uncertainty is actually sitting underneath the dam right now is the whole reason this deserves more attention than a photo of a stranded boat ramp usually gets. There's also a human layer to this that gets flattened every time the story becomes purely a number on a chart. This river supplies drinking water and irrigation across 7 states and parts of Mexico, and it carries treaty obligations to tribal nations whose water rights predate most of the infrastructure we're discussing by generations. Recreation-dependent towns around the lake are watching their entire season shrink alongside the waterline, the same way marina operators near Blue Mesa watched theirs get decimated when that reservoir got tapped as somebody else's backup plan. None of that changes the physics I just walked you through. The sun doesn't care about anyone's tourism season, but it's the reason the physics isn't just an engineering curiosity. And it's the reason people should actually care whether the bypass math works, instead of treating it as a debate for hydrologists to sort out privately. So where does that leave the standard of care question? What would a competent water system manager actually want here, instead of what we're currently getting? There's been ongoing engineering discussion about building new, lower intake structures at Glen Canyon Dam entirely. A permanent fix that would let the dam keep generating power and moving water, even if the reservoir sits well below where the current penstocks sit. That's the kind of project that takes years of planning, environmental review, and funding before a single shovel goes into the canyon wall. It is not something you greenlight in the middle of a summer when the lake is already testing 3,490 feet. If that structural fix had been fast-tracked 5 or 10 years ago, back when the first warning signs were already showing up in the data, this conversation would look completely different right now. Instead, the emergency toolkit everyone's actually relying on is still the same secondary bypass system built in the 1960s, plus borrowing water from upstream neighbors who are running low themselves. You'd want the bypass infrastructure stress tested under sustained conditions before it becomes the emergency plan by default, not after the emergency has already started. You'd want public communication that clearly separates the power pool threshold from the deadpool threshold, instead of blurring them into one vague crisis word that lets people underestimate or overestimate the danger depending on which headline they happen to read that week. You'd want the interstate operating framework finalized well ahead of the physical threshold being tested, not racing it to the finish line at the same time. None of that is radical. It's just basic sequencing. Know the system before you're forced to react to it in real time, instead of finding out what you don't know during the emergency itself. And that's really the root failure sitting underneath this entire situation, if I'm being honest with you. It's not that anyone lied. It's not that there's a hidden villain running the show. It's that the public conversation defaulted to the simplest possible fix: rain, snowpack, fill the bathtub back up, while the actual constraint operating underneath that surface is a mechanical failure point nobody built extra confidence around, and a legal framework that's still being finished while the clock on that mechanical limit keeps running whether anyone's ready or not. The water is going to behave like water. It's going to follow the snowpack it's given, which this year wasn't much. The dam is going to behave like a dam. Thresholds don't negotiate, cavitation doesn't care about press releases, and neither does gravity at 3,370 feet. Those bypass pipes are still sitting down there right now, untested, at the scale this crisis might eventually demand of them, whether or not this coming winter brings a historic snowpack that everyone's quietly hoping shows up. And that's the uncomfortable ending here. Even a genuinely great winter doesn't rebuild the assumption everyone's been running on. It just buys time before the same 32 feet of margin gets tested again. And next time, the question won't be how full the lake looks from a boat ramp. It'll be whether the plumbing underneath it actually does what everyone's been quietly hoping it would for 25 million people who never got a vote on the assumption in the first place. I'm not telling you the sky is falling. I'm telling you the sky was never the thing to watch. Watch the elevation number. Watch which upstream reservoir gets tapped next and how much margin that reservoir has left to give. Watch whether the interstate framework gets finalized before or after the lake tests 3,490 again. Those are the numbers that actually decide this, not whether next January looks pretty in a snowpack photo. The bathtub only has so many places left to borrow water from, and at some point, borrowing isn't a strategy anymore. It's just a countdown with better public relations.